You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 85, our 9th Q&A. I'm your layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Very good, very good. The 9th Q&A, I can hardly believe it.
I know, it's crazy. We're coming up on 1 year, if not, we might already be there. If not, I think our first resurrection of it is in February, I think. So we're not too far away from our 1 year anniversary. Maybe we should get a cake or do something.
Yeah, we should look that up. I didn't even...
or save it for our 100th.
Chronology.
Maybe we should save it for our 100th episode.
Yeah.
I kind of view it like you ended on the 33rd episode. Kind of like Jesus, and then we resurrected it on the 34th.
Yeah, all that Masonic esoteric symbolism there.
It worked out perfect.
Yeah. Well, here's another Masonic symbol for you. I like chocolate cake with chocolate icing.
Okay. Duly noted.
So look out for all that chocolate cake.
Well, we need to think. We're 15 episodes away from 100th, so maybe we should brainstorm on what we could do that's special.
Or we could throw that to the audience.
Hey, shoot us some emails, treystrickland@gmail.com if you got any ideas for our 100th episode.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe somebody will come up with something pretty cool.
We'll find out.
Cooler than us, anyway.
All right. Well, Mike, we've got several questions, so let's just get to it, I guess, if you want.
Sure.
All right. The first one is from Seth, and he's got 3 questions, and he's in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So his first question is, could it be a part of God's original intent to dwell on the earth in the form of man as ruler over all creation? When we see God commanding Adam and Eve to spread the rule of the Garden of Eden over the earth, does that have the culmination in God ruling visibly on the earth as we see in Revelation 21 and 22? And could Lucifer have known that and decided to usurp God's plan by separating them unto himself through their rebellion and thus gain dominance of this earth realm?
Well, the first part of that, it sort of answers itself. I mean, because you do see, in Revelation 21 and 22, God is, physicalized, I guess we could put it that way, physically present. So it sort of answers itself. But I would say this, in biblical theology, God's presence with humanity naturally needs to be veiled or obscured or filtered in some way, other than the occasions of an audible voice or a vision. That's the pattern. That's the pattern in the Old Testament. And of course, New Testament, we get incarnation. But when God appears, he typically appears as something or often someone parsable to humans, and I think also to protect humans from his unfiltered or unveiled presence. So for that reason, I think for God to interact with man in any sort of enduring relationship, that you have to have some sort of embodiment for that. Or at least that embodiment would be the best way to achieve that. And we get the language of embodiment or anthropomorphism, to use the scholarly word, in Genesis chapter 3. We get this in the Eden story. And for those who are wondering, what the reference there is, in Genesis 3:8, that's the reference where, the Lord God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So that's very obviously anthropomorphic language. And that phrasing actually gets picked up elsewhere in the Old Testament about the presence of God, being present among his people and whatnot. So I think from the very beginning, from the very get-go in Eden, we have God in visible, embodied form, and the fact that that's sort of the way that God has to do things, or the way that makes his presence most easily parsable, and the way that allows for a relationship to happen with humans in the most cohesive way. To me, that idea makes sense. So I would say, that there's some sense to that approach, and I think that approach, we get glimpses of it in what we already have back in Genesis with Eden, and then later on. The question about Lucifer was something about, did Lucifer know all this? Know this either intention or plan for embodiment, and having that knowledge, did he decide to usurp God's plan by separating people to himself and then rebelling and so on and so forth. I don't see any necessary connection between God's embodiment, God's choice to be present with man that way, and the rebellion of the Nakash. Again, this cherub throne guardian figure, this divine figure who rebels. The Nakash's motive would have been the same regardless of whether God planned to use embodiment in human form or something else. I don't see a necessary connection between the two ideas. Certainly, the motive of the Nakash was elimination of rivals, as opposed to merely gaining dominance of the earth. In other words, I don't think he would have been satisfied if he would have just been appointed over them. I think it's clear that he wants them to sin, assuming that God will judge sin and eliminate them. I read that the phrase "to desire to be above the stars of El," the stars of God in Isaiah 14, as rebellion and resistance to God's will to have the humans be part of the family and participate in divine governance of the creation. But again, I don't see a necessary connection between God's choice of how he would be present and what the Nakash decides to do. I think he would have decided to do the same thing anyway, regardless of how God was present in the relationship.
All right. Seth's second question is concerning the body of Christ in terms of mission, bringing the light of the gospel to people, groups, and regions. Is there still an overthrowing of the principalities going on? It seems there is a back and forth struggle in this country and many other areas, even while the gospel expands. What is the relation to the church and the powers and principalities today as you see it?
Well, there was a back and forth struggle in the book of Acts, in the days of the apostles. There was lots of persecution. So I don't really see the circumstances as any different. As the body of Christ, kingdom of God expands, the kingdom of darkness shrinks. And there is an ebb and flow. There is a back and forth. But I think there's also, both biblically and I think historically, there's also an inexorable, gradual increase of one, the kingdom of God, versus the other. And we look at we tend to look at our own circumstances. We tend to look at tragedies or terrorism or whatever it is, and so that thought in the isolation that it is in tends to color our perception. But I think I think that's a mistake. I mean, I think the perception, or at least the wording of the question, is, for my taste, a little too focused on this country. But of course, that's the country you live in. That's the perspective you're going to have. So it's hard not to do that. In other words, I think it's a little too focused on the church that we sort of see or that we're aware of. But the church, again, the kingdom of God has been expanding for decades. And, if you go all the way back to the apostolic era, it's for millennia. But let's just take our own day and age. The church has been expanding for decades elsewhere, outside of America. Asia, the church is just exploding, both in terms of let's just take China. There's the visible church, and again, you can't be cynical and say, well, no one who's in an official church is really a Christian. Well, again, that's an overstatement. Talk to some missionaries in China, and you'll realize that isn't true. But the underground church, again, has grown exponentially, and it has in many of these dark places, whether it was Eastern Europe under the Soviet regime, the Middle East, even. I mean, you see churches popping up with frankly acts like miraculous sorts of things happening to kickstart it and propel it. Africa is another case. In other words, outside of the U.S., where it's easy to sort of view that the church here as kind of stagnant, doing lots of other things except for evangelism. I mean, again, it's very easy to look at the situation and sort of think that way. And I think even that is a little too jaded. But outside of, beyond the shores of America, there are places globally, where the church is increasing dramatically, and it's still under persecution. Again, I don't see the situation as being much different than it was in the days of the apostles.
Seth's final question is it right to think that one reason God was so strict with Israel concerning involvement with other nations, marriage, customs, etc., and even seemingly being harsh towards them, is because he actually had an eye toward the redemption through Israel and ultimately Jesus? In other words, wanting to preserve Israel by setting them apart unto him in order through them to bring deliverance to all.
Yeah, I think the survival of Israel, of course, is really crucial to the progress of salvation history. So in broad strokes, I think, that obviously God has an interest in preserving Israel because they are a key element to what his plan is. The Old Testament casts Israel's distinctiveness as being linked to its survival. Again, because its distinctiveness, is fundamentally linked to the notion of loyalty to Yahweh. So, when I say loyalty to Yahweh, you can say that negatively as well, not aligning yourself with other gods. So in biblical times, identity as a people and loyalty to Yahweh, they were tied together and also tied to the land, as we talked about last time with Leviticus 26 and in earlier episodes. You should also think of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. All the other nations are put under the lesser Elohim, the sons of God, and Israel is Yahweh's portion. So the survival of Israel, again, is something that God is intimately interested in, and God wants and will preserve, because that will propel salvation history and be the key to bringing these other nations back into a relationship with him. But in biblical times, all that's wrapped up with a specific piece of land and family relationships, not intermarrying, and population, and what's the extended family versus the inner family, all these different laws. So there's a rationale for, again, ensuring the survival of the people, but also ensuring their survival in the sense that these rules cut them off, or are ostensibly aimed at cutting them off from worshiping other gods, from being seduced into a disloyal relationship to Yahweh. And, the worship of other gods, of course, is viewed in landed conquest terms. To worship another deity in Israel is in effect to surrender not only your loyalty to a different god, to that particular god, but also to surrender your land, because that God is going to be viewed now as dominant in that space, in that turf. So therefore, again, the identity of the people of Yahweh are linked to loyalty to Yahweh, which is linked to the land. And, all these ideas are interconnected because of the covenant relationship. The covenant relationship involves, just look at what the covenant involves. The growth in population. I will make you as the stars of the sky in numeric terms there. Again, for the sake of our discussion, but it's linked to growth of the population. I'll give you a land, it's linked to land, and I'll be your God, you'll be my people. It's linked to loyalty to Yahweh. So all these things are interconnected. And since God looks at that and tells us in the covenant language that it's going to be through you that all the other nations are going to be blessed and they're going to be brought back. Yeah, Israel needs to survive, and these laws are a means to helping that situation happen.
Our next one's from Tom. In Hebrews 10, the author talks about how futile the sacrificial system is when it comes to accomplishing atonement. When bringing this up to a person who holds to the temple being rebuilt and the sacrifices starting again, they mention that even Paul made sacrifices to defend this position in Acts 21.
Yeah, that's very poor logic, on the part of those who would do that for a number of reasons, but I'll get to those, but let's talk about the sacrifice, quote unquote, the offering that Paul brings in Acts 21. The question itself, and I'm not saying the questioner, but just this question, bringing Acts into this picture and then talking about renewing sacrifices in a new temple. The question itself sort of presupposes that Old Testament sacrifices had something to do with forgiveness in a moral sense. And the series on Leviticus, I think, made the point many times that in the overwhelming number of cases, that isn't in view at all. Sacrifices were about making someone fit for sacred space or taking care of ritual uncleanness, taking away the possibility of polluting sacred space so that God wouldn't be offended or, quote, driven away, or God wouldn't, withdraw. So it's not about, I did something wrong and I feel bad, so I'm going to bring this animal and kill it so that God will feel differently toward me and forgive me. The sacrifices are really about, okay, you messed up here, and because you messed up, you're going to pollute sacred space, you're going to pollute the people around you, and then they're going to pollute sacred space. We can't have this. We have to have the presence of God. God is here to dwell with us. We need to have the place that is God's domain be utterly different and kept utterly different. Again, because there's a difference between him and you. This is the system that he has set up. If you want him to be with you, this is what we have to do. So it was about sacred space. It wasn't about the individual bringing an offering, in that sense. But the question kind of, I think, distorts that. Now, when we went through Acts on the podcast, we noted that there were a number of possible interpretations of what Paul did. The most common one is probably the Nazirite vow. If listeners recall, I went to Darrell Bock's commentary, and I'll read a little bit of that here again when he comments on the Nazirite view, which again is just one of several views. I'm going to really focus here on 2 items instead of 3 or 4. But the purification for Paul, Bock says, is to restore purity, after he has traveled in Gentile areas. So again, we're far afield from this moral salvation kind of thing that we associate with the work on the cross. Jesus didn't die so that you could be clean because you went into a Gentile area. All right, it's quite different. Purification that Paul offers, again, is most likely for this reason. Now, sometimes, that might have been associated with the Nazirite vow, but typically Nazirite vows, were not associated with that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about the Nazirite option and then this idea of restoration of purity. They could be related, but we're going to consider them, differently. So if it's the Nazirite vow, then Nazirite vows typically lasted for 30 days. Again, at least according to the rabbinic literature of the time of the New Testament era. In this view, Nazirite view, the payment for sacrifices that Paul does in Acts 21, verse 26, and the shaving of the head would be part of the observance of the law about the Nazirites, which we get in the book of Numbers. That's Numbers 6, basically verses 2 to 21, most of the chapter there. Now, it could refer again to restoring purity generally, but they could be separate things, as I mentioned. Let me just read Numbers 6 through 11. If any man dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his consecrated head, that he shall shave his head on the day of his cleansing. On the 7th day he shall shave it. On the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall offer one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, and make atonement for him because he sinned by reason of the dead body, and he shall consecrate his head that same day. Now that's part of the Nazirite vow. You'll notice that the quote-unquote sin is not moral. It's touching a dead body. And we've already talked, again, in our series in Leviticus about how the quote-unquote sin offering actually refers to a purification offering, or as people liked my phrase, decontamination offering. That's what it was. It was not about moral forgiveness, again, in the way we think about Jesus on the cross. So I think, again, the original question sort of distorts that or doesn't recognize that distinction. The burnt offering, of course, had nothing to do with moral guilt, moral culpability. The burnt offering was what you would give, to go visit the Lord. The whole burnt offering idea. So the Nazirite vow, if that is indeed what Paul is doing here in Acts 21, has nothing to do with the kind of moral atonement and moral forgiveness that the New Testament associates with what Jesus did on the cross. It's about decontamination and becoming clean from becoming infected ritually by touching a dead body. Now, it's actually not clear that the Nazirite vow is in view with what Paul's doing. People go there mentally because of the shaving of the head. It makes them think of the Nazirite vow. But 3 chapters prior to Acts 21, where we see Paul going into the temple and doing this vow, in Acts 18:18, there is this comment about Paul having spent a lot of time in Gentile territory. Acts 18:18 says, after this Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. Again, so you have a couple issues here. This is sort of making a point that Paul had been among Gentiles in Gentile territory for a while, and he actually has the hair cut before he ever gets to Jerusalem. So you have to wonder, well, wasn't the cutting of the hair like at the end of the Nazirite vow? So you could read that and say, well, the fact that Paul cuts his hair earlier, and when you get to Acts 21, he isn't the one cutting his hair, by the way. It's the other guys who are said to cut their hair. You could say, well, maybe this is not a Nazirite vow. Now, having said that, Josephus, at least in one place, does point out that the way Jews practiced the Nazirite vow during that time was that some of them did cut the hair before offering the sacrifice. In other words, before the final phase of bringing the quote-unquote sin offering or the quote-unquote burnt offering again. So that it's possible that even though Paul cut his hair 3 chapters earlier, that doesn't really disqualify what he's doing from being a Nazirite vow, but it isn't really clear. There's just ambiguity there. Now, I think the alternative again, is sort of to divorce this from the Numbers 6 passage, the Nazirite situation. Head shaving was also associated with taking more personal vows. In other words, something between you and the Lord. It could even be for Thanksgiving. Again, it doesn't have to be necessarily for any kind of moral violation. So the offerings of Acts 21:26 may have nothing to do with number 6 and the Nazirite vow. We just don't know. Bach, of course, as I read a few minutes ago, favors the general restoration to purity because Paul had been in Gentile territory. To me, that does make a lot of sense. He doesn't want to go into the temple, of course. If he does go into the temple, he has to do it under these circumstances because of the Gentile contact. Let me just pull out one statement here from Josephus or about Josephus. Gentiles were not allowed, according to Josephus in Antiquities. This is 15:11:5, the book 15, 11th section, so on and so forth. Gentiles were not allowed into the main temple area, and they could be put to death if they were caught there. They actually have, this is Bach now, Bach says that 4.5-foot tall stone markers inscribed in Greek and Latin in the outer court that surrounded the court of women, again, this is the New Testament temple, announced to foreigners that they were prohibited from entering the sanctuary. 2 of those notices have actually been found, and they read, quote, "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and the enclosure. Anyone who is caught trespassing will bear personal responsibility for his ensuing death," unquote. So it was a serious thing to bring Gentiles in. You say, well, why do we mention that? Because if you go to the Acts 21 instance, Paul gets accused of doing that. Now, he hadn't actually done it, but Paul gets accused of doing that. I mean, they accuse him of teaching against the people, against the law, against the temple. They say he brought Greeks into the temple. They apparently suppose that he had brought Trophimus of Ephesus into the temple area because that's one of the guys he's traveling with, a Gentile. That's in Acts 20, verse 4. So, there's this whole thing about bringing a Gentile into the temple, but they also add this accusation that he has defiled the temple. And that charge, again, this is Bach, and I think again, this makes sense. That charge may have extended from Paul's stay in Gentile territory, according to Acts 18. Now, that's a very long and convoluted way of saying, look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's a Nazirite vow or some other vow that concerned ritual purity. Both the Nazirite vow and those other vows were not about moral transgressions. They were about incurring impurity on your person. And if you go back to the Old Testament impurity laws, that's why you got a purification offering. I'm sorry it's translated sin offering because it makes it sound like a moral violation. Okay, that is not the point. And of course, if it's Nazirite, you had to have a burnt offering in there, again, to approach God and have him accept you. But it's not for moral violation. It specifically says in Numbers 9, it's because he touched a dead body. Okay, or he had, touched something else that he wasn't supposed to touch. It's about, again, this ritual impurity kind of state. Now let's go from that to this larger question of bringing back the sacrifices. I'll admit up front, this is a theological pet peeve with me because this makes no sense at all. If the sacrifices are brought back, then the writer of Hebrews was wrong. He made an error because the writer of Hebrews has the work on the cross covering past, present, and future people, sinners, all of us. There is absolutely no coherent rationale for bringing back sacrifices post-Jesus. What would their purpose be? They can't be to atone for moral forgiveness, because that would be covered by the cross, unless the writer of Hebrews made a boo-boo. Okay, I would suggest that if that's the case, then you, the person who's saying, hey, the sacrifices are going to come back, I don't know what the basis of your salvation is then. Because if the writer of Hebrews is wrong, then maybe you aren't covered. Maybe you aren't. Your sins haven't been atoned for. Maybe you'll be lucky enough to live during the sacrificial era when it comes. Again, these are absurdities. Now, what usually happens is people who defend this idea usually argue that renewed sacrifices are somehow a memorial of the cross, a reminder of what the cross meant or what had happened at the cross, what Jesus' death meant. We bring back animal sacrifices to somehow teach this object lesson, to help instruct Jews or maybe other people about what happened on the cross. Okay, that is logically and theologically absurd for a couple simple, straightforward reasons. If Jesus' sacrifice covered us, those of us who lived well after the cross event, why wouldn't it cover anyone else who lived after the cross event, including people who are living later in a millennium? It's usually the literal millennialist crowd that argues for a literal temple needing to be rebuilt. And then, of course, you have to have sacrifices, because what's the point of having a temple if you don't do sacrifices and all this kind of stuff? Well, hey, all those people who lived during the millennium and afterwards, guess what? They lived after the cross just like you are. So why are you covered and they're not? Doesn't make any sense. Why would people need sacrifices? As a reminder of the atonement of Jesus, here I have a suggestion. Why not just hand them a New Testament and have them read about it? Why would anyone need sacrifices for understanding how Jesus fulfilled what needed to happen, or fulfilled the typology of Old Testament sacrifices, when they could just read it like you and I did? And with respect to modern Jews, they haven't needed the Old Testament law or the cross commemorated to become believers in the Messiah since the cross. You just give them the gospel. You hand them the New Testament. You speak the gospel to them, and they believe. They don't need a sacrificial system in place to comprehend the message of the gospel. What about Jews in the New Testament era living after 70 AD when the temple was destroyed? Guess what? They could still understand the gospel and still believe it and become followers of Jesus. Again, this idea that we need sacrifices either to atone for sin makes no sense. And it also doesn't make any sense if the purpose of the sacrifice is to commemorate or memorialize the meaning of the cross. Hey, just hand them a New Testament. Why don't you tell them? Because that's how you and I learned it. And we were fully capable of embracing it, or believing it or rejecting it. Again, this is baggage that comes along with this insistence that a literal temple has to be rebuilt. I'll say something else here, but I'm not going to rabbit trail with it. You don't need a literal rebuilt temple to have an earthly kingdom. You can still have an earthly kingdom without the literal temple. In fact, at the end of the book of Revelation, it specifically says there is no temple. Okay, but setting that aside, you don't need to have Jesus coming back and ruling on the earth. You don't have to have a temple for that. You just don't. We tend to assume that, but the purpose of the temple is obsolete. We don't need the sacrifices. Again, unless the writer of Hebrews is wrong, and other passages too. The New Testament is actually pretty clear about its use of temple language in association with Jesus' body. Spirit and the presence of God was in him, to say the least, and of course believers. That's why Paul says we are the temple, you are the temple, collectively and individually. Why should we look for a literal temple when 1 Corinthians 3:6, 1 Corinthians 6:19-20 have believers individually and corporately as the temple of God? Again, none of this just doesn't make any sense. And here's the kicker. If you're a literalist reading the book of Revelation, which again, most of this kind of millennialist is, that wants to have the literal temple rebuilt. If you're literally reading Revelation 11, then guess where the temple is in Revelation 11? It's in heaven. That's what the text says. So the New Testament actually says that the temple is in heaven, but somehow we need it back here on earth. Why? Again, I could go on for another half hour just bringing up points of bringing up conundra for this view. And I know why it's out there. It's out there because of an over-literalizing of certain passages about the temple, and then you sort of have to ignore the way the New Testament temple talk, and you have to kind of flinch, about the writer of the book of Hebrews and all that stuff. But using the sacrifices, using what Paul does as a wedge, to argue this, is really poor thinking. Because no matter what Paul did, whether it was Nazirite or something else, it had nothing to do with the kind of forgiveness, the kind of atonement that resulted from the work on the cross, as opposed to what you read in the Old Testament sacrifices. Again, those are largely just about purifying sacred space, making you fit so that you didn't pollute things that had been designated God's domain and God's turf.
The next one's from Michael. Do you think that God, who knows all things both real and possible, and knows all the possible decisions that we could make in any given situation, chooses not to know the one decision out of all the possibilities that we will make?
Why does God need to decide to not know the decisions we will make? I mean, the question presumes that foreknowledge necessitates predestination. See, God has to unknow that when that actually happens, because if he foreknew that when it happens, it had to be predestinated. The other ones were not. Look, foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination. Even the axiom that the question used, God knows all things real and possible, if that is true, the fact that God knows possibilities and all possibilities don't happen tells you that God's foreknowledge of those possibilities did not result in the predestination of all those possibilities. Foreknowledge and predestination are not inextricably linked. Foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination. God knowing all things real and possible actually undermines that idea. So, God's knowing what choice among all the possible options we will make doesn't require that choice's predestination. Okay, it might have been predestinated. I mean, God is free to do that if he wants to. My point is that it's not required. It's not necessitated. So God doesn't need to unknow things that he foreknows. In my experience, Calvinists, again, who get into these sort of convoluted ideas, they simply assume, and largely just because that's the way the system is taught, they simply assume that foreknowledge and predestination are inextricably linked. But again, you go to passages like 1 Samuel 23, where God clearly foreknows two things that never happen. Okay, it is just not the case. Foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination.
Next one is from Sean. Some scholars believe that Jewish religion has evolved over time, eventually ending up at monotheism. The divine council worldview seems to blow this up. It also seems then to discredit that El and Yahweh were not always worshipped concurrently, and that one came after the other and replaced the other. Is this true? If so, then could that be a reason why more scholars seem to not want to accept the binitarian view?
Well, the questioner's a little overly optimistic. Most scholars who are of the, it's hard to pick the right terms here. Most, if I say critical scholars, it makes it sound like evangelical scholars aren't critical. If I say non-confessional scholars, it makes it sound like if you're a confessional scholar, you only have to think one way, or you can only think one way. But I'll put it this way. Most non-confessional scholars, in other words, most scholars who aren't committed to some form of what we would loosely call Bible-believing Christianity. Most people who don't fall into that category, they actually think the divine council idea proves the evolutionary idea. They're not afraid of it. They use it to promote the evolutionary idea from polytheism to monotheism, because they look at things like council references. They look at things like more than one Elohim, a bunch of Elohim, flying around. They look at that as polytheism. And then they interpret certain passages in the Old Testament as getting rid of that and evolving toward monotheism. Like Psalm 82, when God sentences the gods to die like men. He says, see, that God says all those gods are going to be put to death. And in the Israelite mind, they were put to death, and we're only left with one. And so we've evolved to monotheism. That's how they'll take Psalm 82. Now they get there because they refuse, or they fail to define Elohim like an Israelite would. Instead, they look at plural Elohim, and they assume that the word Elohim has something to do with a unique set of attributes. And, that means there's more than one. There's more than one capital G-O-D here. That's polytheism. Again, what I've been saying, basically my whole academic career is saying, look, that's dumb, because the departed human dead are called Elohim. Obviously, no Israelite is going to think that their dead relative is on par in terms of attributes and characteristics with the God of Israel, or even any other god like Baal. I mean, they're just not the same. Elohim has nothing to do with a set of unique attributes. It really doesn't have to do with specific attributes at all. The reason why so many different things are called Elohim is because Elohim is a term you would use to describe where that entity properly belongs or lives. Every occupant, every disembodied occupant of the spirit world is an Elohim. That's why it's plural, and that's why it gets used that way. But if you're looking at Elohim thinking, I'm going to look at Elohim just like modern Americans or modern Westerners look at the letters G-O and D, because when I see G-O and D, I think of omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence. And if I put an S on that, we got polytheism. That's actually what they do. you have scholars. I mean, I could give you names. You have scholars that parse a Hebrew word the way a modern Westerner would parse an English word in terms of its meaning. It just doesn't make any sense. And not only that, but they'll somehow ignore or miss all of the divine plurality stuff that shows up after this wonderful evolution to, magnificent monotheism had occurred. Case in point, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I published an article last year. It was part of my dissertation on, hey, look, there are 160 references to plural Elohim in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a couple dozen of which are also in divine council contexts in those texts. So what happened to this wonderful evolution? Didn't the people who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, didn't they get the memo? Hey, we're monotheists now, don't write like this. No, it's very clear in what they're saying and those scenes, if you actually go read them, that they're talking about animate spirit beings in the spiritual world. And over in that world, Yahweh is an Elohim, but none of these other ones are like Yahweh. He's unique. He's incomparable. They're very conservative in their theology. I mean, the people who, the people who lived at Qumran were so conservative in their theology, they thought that the priests, the Pharisees, were heretics. I mean, it's crazy to think that they're like some kind of, liberal or something. No, they get it. The people who don't get it, I think, are the modern scholars who just parse these terms, these biblical terms, in modern terms. So, I mean, to get the full view of this, I would say you need to go up to moreunseenrealm.com. That's the companion website to the book, The Unseen Realm. And chapter 3 and 4, there are going to be links in there to some of the articles I've written specifically on this topic, some of the journal articles. One of those, or actually two of them, I think you'll find, if memory serves me, are about the El and Yahweh question. To an Orthodox Israelite, to a biblical writer, El and Yahweh were not separate deities. Okay, to other Israelites who were not theologically careful or who were deliberately sort of apostate, well, they may have viewed them as separate characters. You have to realize that Israelites, there's no one category for Israelites. It's kind of like today, people who call themselves Christians. Well, they could believe 100 different things. I mean, you have Christians who, again, aren't even Trinitarian. Okay, I still accept Jesus on the cross, but I can't remember what the term is. Certain types of oneness Pentecostals. I mean, they'll insist on embracing the gospel, the work of Jesus on the cross, but yet they'll deny the Trinity. And again, my point is, you have, just as today you have this vast, and in some cases we look at strange variation under one term, in this case Christianity. It's the same thing in the ancient world. What was Israelite religion? Well, it depends who you talk to. Well, if you're talking to the biblical writers, and we only know what they think because of the text they gave us that we have, El and Yahweh are not viewed as separate deities. And of course, there are scholars who argue that there are vestiges of this still in the Old Testament. Again, you're going to have to read my articles specifically on that issue to understand why I think that just doesn't make any sense and is actually contradicted by a number of passages in the Old Testament. So divine council stuff and the binitarian stuff does not deter people from arguing for an evolution from polytheism to monotheism. In many cases, it encourages them to argue for that. And I've tried to explain here why they sort of take the paths that they do and how that works. But to get the fuller picture, you'll have to reference the articles.
This question's from Hans. Can you explain the meaning of Jew in the Bible? Does it refer to a member of the kingdom of Judah only? And what about the meaning in the New Testament, Jew versus Israelite?
Yeah, this question, I think we'd have to spend an entire episode on, because this is mind-numbingly complicated.
I vote we make it a whole episode.
There are whole books, whole dissertations written, and I know because I'm looking at one here in my library as I speak, on this question. I mean, you get into issues like, okay, are Jew and Israelite different terms? If they are, what's the difference? If they're not, why are two terms used? Well, what about, does it matter if how Jews or Israelites refer to themselves as opposed to someone else referring to them? Does the meaning change? Like I hate to use this illustration, but I think people will get what I mean. The N word in our culture, if you're black, you can use that in certain contexts because it's a self-reference and it's tolerated and a certain meaning is attributed to it. or meanings. Whereas if you're outside that community, it's offensive to say that. Well, there are meanings of terms that there are terms that mean certain things within a community. You use them of yourself, and things that the same term can mean something different if it's used by outsiders. You got that issue going on. What about Jew versus Judaizer in the New Testament? Are they the same or different? What about Gentiles? How do Gentiles in the New Testament use the term Jew? Again, that's that insider-outsider thing going on. Is the term ethnic or religious or both? We have even that problem today. Think about what Paul does with the term Jew. I actually referenced this passage in our last episode in Leviticus, but Romans 2:28. And if you actually go to Romans 2:28, look at how Paul muddies the water. He says here, "For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter." Oh, so in other words, Paul, like a believing Gentile, could be a Jew? Well, Paul would say yes. Why? Because over in Galatians 3, he says that those who are the real children of Abraham are believers, whether they're Jew or Gentile or not. So this is an amazingly complicated topic. Now, for those, I don't know when we would do an episode on this, but it would take a whole episode. But if you don't want to wait for that, the most up-to-date recent work on this topic is a book by a guy named Graham Harvey, and the title is The True Israel. Subtitle, Uses of the Names Jew, Hebrew, and Israel in Ancient Jewish and Early Christian Literature. Now, that's available on Amazon. The hardcover is $252. That's the bad news. But the good news is that if you go up to Amazon, at least in short hearing of this, you can get it for $9.99 in paperback. That's how I got it. So if you want to get a head start and read the most this is a published dissertation, rewritten for publication. It's a scholarly work. The publisher is Brill, very famous scholarly publisher. Get that book. I will give Trey the link to that on Amazon. Do not spend $250. Watch which buttons you push. Okay. Spend your $9.99, get the paperback if you want to jump into the topic now.
Unless you've got a nice library that
yeah, unless money is no object.
If that's the case, no expense. You could send an extra copy to me if you'd like. I digress. Okay, our next question from Craig in Waterloo, Iowa. Mike has used the term pre-scientific era several times. I was wondering if you could ask Mike to define what he means when he uses this term.
Yeah, maybe I should use pre-modern or pre-modernity, because that's essentially what I mean. Pre-scientific, it really refers to a set of pre-modern circumstances when it comes to the knowledge of the natural world. So what I'm referring to is that people in the biblical world, including biblical writers, did not have the knowledge about the natural world and its forces, biology, anatomy, chemistry, physics, whatever, that we have. Their knowledge precedes fundamental discoveries and points of knowledge only achieved in the modern world. So that's not to say there was no knowledge of the natural world in antiquity. There certainly was, but it was primitive by today's standards. In the ancient world, science as they knew it, and many people don't even want to use that term of ancient knowledge, but I'm not that much of a stickler. But science as they knew it arose from experience of the natural world and the five senses. It did not arise from the scientific method, or was not articulated or thought about in terms of discoveries deriving from the scientific method. Example, the ancients did naked eye astronomy and did it really well, but they knew nothing about celestial mechanics and celestial objects beyond the reach of the naked eye. This is why Mesopotamian astronomical texts, and the Mesopotamians and the Babylonians were extraordinarily detailed, the Assyrians, in their astronomy. But you will never find an object beyond Saturn. Why? Because that's all they could see. And they don't know exactly how things work. They don't know celestial mechanics. What they know is what they can observe and mark down and then watch for repeated patterns. It's not science by today's standards, but they are exploring and investigating and learning about the natural world. Another example, the ancients certainly knew plants that could cure you of things or reduce pain, induce an abortion, just heal certain injuries faster. They knew stuff like that. They knew that children shared traits with their parents, but they don't know anything about genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, heredity on a genetics level, how it works. They don't know why mutations occur, stuff like that. A third example, the last one. The ancients knew a lot about applied physics, leverage, mathematics to build things. They were very good at this, but they don't know how to split the atom. They don't know anything about that. So when I say pre-scientific, I really do mean pre-modern, and I will try to use that term instead. I don't like pre-modern though, because it makes ancients sound like they're dragging their knuckles and Neanderthalish, kind of brutes and unintelligent. I don't want to communicate that either, because they weren't. They were really, really smart. It's just that they didn't have the tools and the methods to know what we know today about the natural world.
The next one's from Travis. Mike has mentioned throughout the series that there isn't a one-to-one relationship between the sacrificial system and Jesus, but he mentioned in passing a few weeks ago that he sees substitutionary atonement in the offerings. Can he expand on how the sacrificial system informs our understanding of Christ's death and how it accomplished salvation?
Well, in terms of the sacrificial system, an impure person had to have a substitute to take care of the impurity. You couldn't take care of your own impurity with your own self. So there has to be something that God deemed acceptable to accept you in sacred space and in the life of the community, at least as it pertained to sacred space. So by definition, or from the get-go, if you're polluted, you ain't coming anywhere close to the place that you need to come without the means to undo your pollution. And that ain't you. So it has to be something else. So just in principle, there's substitution is necessary there. But there's also substitution in the sense that, again, when sanctity was compromised or violated, the teaching point is that there had to be some penalty for that. There had to be some fixing of that. Something had gone wrong with you that made you ineligible for sacred space. It doesn't have to be a moral violation. Again, most of the time, it had nothing to do with that. It could be, something innocuous. I touched a woman when she was menstruating. Okay, well, you're unclean now. Again, it has nothing to do with a moral offense. And there were lots and lots and lots of these. So without a substitution, again, because you're not coming anywhere close to the sanctuary here, without a substitution, something that will enable you to, again, in the worst circumstances, be punished directly by God, possibly lose your life. Without that, the sanctuary was in perpetual threat of contamination. And so that's why we had to have, again, something, whether an animal or a plant or grain or whatever it was, depending on, again, your level of, if you were very poor, didn't necessarily have to be a blood sacrifice. And, we've been through these passages in Leviticus in the series, so I think the audience is fairly well familiar with them. But something had to be brought in your place, just in a broad conceptual sense, to decontaminate you. And depending on the offense, again, not having that could be pretty severe. Other, issues were reparations. Okay, let's say you did something where a quote-unquote guilt offering was needed. And again, the better translation of that is the reparation offering. Again, you yourself couldn't make restitution necessarily, depending on what the situation was. And so something had to be brought into the picture to not only rectify the situation, your guilt, but also to compensate either God or compensate the person wronged. So by definition, you have to have something else along with you. Again, these needs and these fixes are, again, conceptually quite distinct, again, from what we're talking about, what the New Testament talks about, what we're talking about, or what the New Testament talks about with what happens on the cross. Yeah, we can talk about Jesus being typologically, our substitute and, our opportunity for redemption. But there are a number of disconnects because of the specific circumstances with the Old Testament system and the all-encompassing nature and the moral nature of salvation when it comes to the work of Jesus on the cross. So the fact that a thing is analogous doesn't mean it's the same in all the elements. It can be quite different. And this is again why, the writer of Hebrews is very correct by saying, look, the blood of bulls and goats just ain't cutting it. I mean, they are a very inferior system, a very inferior substitute, if you will, to what we have with Jesus. So it's kind of insane to want to go back to that or to think of it on the same terms. But let's just think a little bit more broadly about it. sacrifice just in and of itself, you had to have that for access to God in the Old Testament. You couldn't have access to God. You couldn't, worship God as an Israelite, without these things, because they defined your proximity to sacred space and whatnot. Now, sacrifice made relationship possible on that level and prevented God again from withdrawing his presence or judging people directly for violation. But none of that was really directed to salvation, again, as we think of it in this need for moral, spiritual reconciliation between you and God. Example, how could somebody like Naaman the leper ever be saved? He was from Syria, and he goes back to Syria, but yet he confesses that Yahweh is the God of gods, and he has to take dirt back. And I've used this illustration a number of times. So like if he couldn't offer a sacrifice, he couldn't be saved? No. It's very clear that he had the necessary faith. He aligned himself with the true God. He was a believer. Rahab, same thing. She is commended for her faith before becoming part of Israel. I mean, she's in the Hebrews 11, and she's commended for something she does before she ever joined the Israelite community, before she ever had access or had any sense, of sacrifice. Sacrifice wasn't about salvation, is the point I'm getting to. The sacrifice on the cross of Jesus has everything to do with salvation. Again, in this sense of there's a moral offense, there's a spiritual barrier, a spiritual estrangement from God that needs reconciliation. That's a different thing, and it requires a different kind of sacrifice, Jesus, that besides or set against what you see in the Old Testament. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Again, because two things are analogous does not mean that they have to align in every instance, because often they will not.
Our next question is from Garth. In Leviticus 6, 1-7, these seem like definitive, deliberate acts against the law, except for the realizing language, which connotes that the acts were actually unintentional, and thus how it fits in with these other restitution offerings. The ESV shows the possibility of unintentionally much better than many other translations like the NIV, where the realizing aspect is simply stated as becomes guilty.
Yeah, there is something of a translation variance. I actually mentioned this exception in one of the episodes in Leviticus. I don't recall which one, but I said something about if the person felt guilty and confessed, then expiation was allowed in certain cases where a violation happened to be deliberate. But the reverse is also true. If there was no confession of the act, then bringing a sacrifice accomplished nothing. So these verses make confession mandatory for being factored into sacrifice in these situations because there was no witness in the circumstance. My larger point about unintentionality, it's sort of negatively stated, which might be confusing, but high-handed sins, again, intentional, deliberate sins against God, against his person, were not tolerated. And in fact, you couldn't atone, for blasphemy and murder because it was, killing God in effigy and all that sort of stuff. Unconfessed sins against fellow humans couldn't simply be wiped away by sacrifice. There had to be contrition. And so the sacrifice itself didn't have any value per se. In these instances, and again, this is the part in Leviticus, the chapter that brings these up, confession was necessary, else these cases wouldn't be an exception. So God allowed that. But the sacrifice itself wouldn't have any effect if there was no contrition and remorse. You'd sort of be in the same spot as the sins that didn't have any solution. But many other intentional sins get no opportunity. There is no ransom, like for murder and things like that. So, maybe that helps. But there's again, the key principle again is that the sacrifice itself doesn't take care of this intentional act without, and God allows this, without some evidence of contrition in the specific cases mentioned in those verses.
Okay, the last question is from Greg. I just listened to Leviticus 11 podcast concerning dietary laws. In the flood story of Genesis, Noah takes 7 pairs of clean animals into the ark. This was centuries before the dietary laws were given at Sinai. How did Noah know what was clean or not? I'm assuming God told him, but the Bible is silent on the matter.
Yeah, this is actually a nice catch by the questioner, because this is yet another reason why many people believe that Genesis 6-8, really Genesis 1-11, was composed after the Mosaic era. Now, I personally think, and I've said this before, that Genesis 1 through 11 is at least predominantly post-Mosaic because of the repeated Babylonian context for basically everything in there, and most everything in there. And the context of Moses is not Babylonian, it's Egyptian. So having said that, there are actually a couple ways you could look at this. I mean, again, most scholars are going to look at this and say, well, yeah, it's there because, it was written later and it's trying to link what's happening here to the system of clean and unclean so that we know Noah was a good guy, that kind of thing. He wouldn't offer an unclean sacrifice. So again, let's just start there. You'll notice, again, if you read through that, not only this passage that's specifically quoted, which I believe would be Genesis 7:2, but also in chapter 8, the clean or unclean animals here do not refer really to food, to animals being consumed. The reference here isn't to food laws. Permission to eat was apparently, at least from the biblical text, only given by God after the flood. So the clean and unclean animals that are loaded onto the ark don't have anything to do with what you're going to eat. The point of them is sacrifice. So if you go to Genesis 7:2, for instance, and, I'll turn there real quickly and read the statement that's made. Well, let's just start in verse 1. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, so on and so forth. So, this is obviously, before the flood, it's a precursor, and the permission to eat meat had not yet been given. So you can't really presume that the clean and unclean distinction here is about food laws, is the point. So, how do we account for this? Again, one view is that this is here, and it refers to sacrifice because it doesn't refer to food. It refers to sacrifice. Of course, we don't have a sacrificial system yet. You only get that with Moses. So this must be post-Mosaic. It's put here, maybe a later gloss. Maybe the whole thing is composed after the Mosaic period to avoid any possible suggestion about whether Noah would have offered an unclean animal. So it either creates or presumes consistency for sacrifice in this regard. Otherwise, somebody could come along and say, well, Noah wasn't really righteous. How do we know he didn't offer unclean animals? That kind of thing. So, and again, that's a possibility. Now, there are other ways to look at this. You could presume that, again, in the context of sacrifice, that the clean and unclean distinction, in fact, existed in Israel before Moses, before this was written. Let's say that you're going to assume Mosaic authorship of the flood account, and even before you get in the biblical history, to the sacrificial system, you could say, well, that this was a distinction for sacrifice that everybody just sort of knew. All the descendants of Abraham, they just sort of knew that some animals you don't sacrifice, others you do, and then this just gets woven into the story in different ways, by Moses, the author. I mean, you could say that, you could assume that. There's no biblical text that tells us that. We don't have clean and unclean distinctions. For instance, when the patriarchs offer animals, we don't get instances of an unclean animal being offered, but we don't get any statement about clean and unclean. So it's an assumption. It might have some coherence, but you don't actually have the statement. So, how would you know? Again, I'm not terribly bothered by the first option. Again, the post-Mosaic. I don't see why every word in the Torah has to be written by Moses or in Moses' time period. Torah Moshe, law of Moses, can be the law about Moses, the law associated with Moses, the law focused on Moses. It can mean it's a simple construct relationship between two nouns in Hebrew. To insist that whenever you see it, it only means that the law that originated with Moses is an over-reading of the text. Okay, this is a boogeyman that we don't need to fear. So I don't mind the first one. The second one is possible. The third option, and I hate to say it this way, but I'm gonna. You could just pretend the distinction isn't there. Now, I don't advise this one because it's cheating, but you'll actually run into this in commentaries. And I have an example. I mean, some evangelical commentators will do this. They basically play at word games to say, well, there's nothing to look at here, citizen. There's no, this isn't really even a question. Okay, here's a quotation from one commentary, and it says this. The text does not say that Noah is to take aboard clean and unclean animals. He is to bring with him animals that are clean and those that are not clean. Like, what's the difference? What's the difference? But this is an academic commentary. Well, I laugh, but here's the difference. In Levitical material, the word for unclean is tameh, spelled tet mem aleph. In Genesis, the phrase not clean is not that word. It's not the Levitical word. It's lo tahor. literally meaning not clean instead of unclean. So tameh, unclean, versus lo tahor, not clean. And so some commentators will say, well, that's just a huge difference because they don't use the same word that's used in Leviticus. Well, does it really mean anything different? I mean, really? I mean, I'll read his statement again. The text doesn't say that Noah is to take aboard clean and unclean animals. He is to bring with him animals that are clean and those that are not clean. Again, for my taste, I don't really see much of a difference there. Yeah, I know the Hebrew lemmas are different, but would an Israelite look at that and think of it like an evangelical who wants to affirm Mosaic authorship in every word? I doubt it. I really doubt it. Again, trying to explain it in this way to me is just really, it's kind of sophistry. If you don't know that term, you can look it up, but it's like trying to sound academic when you're really not making any sense. And that is sort of how I look at this statement. I don't think it's a coherent thing to say.
I think you just described me on this podcast.
What, lo tahor? Tommy.
Mike, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, this one's from me. Can you expound on what Jesus said in the New Testament about Leviticus 24, the eye for an eye language and turning the other cheek?
You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other. Okay, the cheek idea is not at least that I can tell. I'm looking up cross references here. I don't see that it's drawn anywhere from the Old Testament. So I don't think he's quoting anything, that we could sort of go back to in Leviticus. You're not going to have this come from Leviticus. I think the way I'd answer this is, if you recall, in the last episode, there was this debate in the rabbinic community about whether lex talionis, eye for eye kind of language, was meant to be literal, or whether you could interpret that as being some sort of compensation being acceptable. In other words, you don't have to literalize the punishment, but you're offering something in exchange in that sense. So you could read this, and say Jesus is declining to respond literally. In other words, he's not saying, yeah, if somebody, pokes your eye out, go mutilate him. He's not opting for the literalistic stance, and that would actually have precedent in his own time period, that, we don't have to take these statements as requiring a literal mutilation or a literal response. If you remember last week, on a case-by-case basis, the Old Testament actually does both. Sometimes there was a compensation that was less than a literal exchange, crime and punishment. Other times there wasn't. Sometimes it was literal, other times it wasn't. So, there is precedent for that. I think what Jesus is arguing here is, I don't think he's really taking a shot or thinking necessarily of that debate, even though you could argue that because the precedent is there among the rabbis. They were talking about this. To me, it just sounds like being willing to suffer for the other person, willing to take, abuse if you're being harmed or something, having something inflicted upon you and you don't deserve it because you haven't done anything unrighteous, then be willing to do that. But since he's not, quoting anything specific in the Old Testament, I don't know that I could say much more than that. But that's the impression I get. Be willing to suffer, something, to be righteous, even if you suffer as a righteous person. Be willing to take that abuse, and that in and of itself is a righteous behavior choice.
Guess what, Mike?
What?
That's it. No more questions.
That'll be good enough.
All right. Well, can you please tell us what's next?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're not going to do a book. I've decided I want to do some topics, and at least one of them actually derives from something I've flirted with on earlier episodes of the podcast. And I said, I more or less promised I would devote a full episode to this. But here are, in no particular order, so don't presume anything about this order, but here are a series of topics that I want to devote at least one episode to, and they are as follows. When Jesus, as the Messiah, presenting himself as the Messiah, to the people anyway, to the populace, when he goes around casting out demons, why would people associate that with something that the Messiah would do, with something that would be connected in some way with the kingdom of God? Because if you look in your Old Testament, there's no clear reference that oh, the Son of David, the Messiah, will cast out demons when he comes. There's nothing like that. So where does this idea come from? Why was it acceptable? Why did people see that and associate it with messianic activity? So that's one topic. Another topic is the head covering issue in 1 Corinthians 11. We will probably have to put some kind of censor label on this one. I think that's an overstatement. I think we can do that without anything like that. But I will say if you have your kids listening to this, and boy, if you're a parent and have your kids listening to Leviticus, I don't know. It brings up some questions about your parenting, I guess. But
yeah, as in you're a good parent. Because I don't know where you're going with that.
Oh, there you go. Well, this one you might have to think twice. But we'll do an episode on the head covering. That's 1 Corinthians 11. Why does Paul say what he does about the head covering, and then he has this presumably throwaway line that, hey, I'm talking to you about this because of the angels. Okay, what's up with that? Now, another topic, number 3, would be the stones of fire. This is a reference that comes from Ezekiel 28. I figured that's worth a full episode. What does that language mean? Where does it come from? It does have something to do with divine counsel stuff, so that'll be a topic. Another one will be the whole concept of heavenly tablets or heavenly books. Again, we see this in apocalyptic literature, in end times scenarios and afterlife scenarios, often connected with the end times. Where does this idea come from? What exactly are the writers thinking when they talk about heavenly tablets, the book of life, different books like that? So we'll spend an episode on that. 1 Corinthians 15 would be another episode that specifically the whole conversation about the spiritual body. Again, how should we think about the spiritual body? Is that an oxymoron? Like, what did that mean to the hearers? The people Paul's writing to in the first century. I mean, how did they parse that? Okay, how did they understand it? How did they think about it? And then another topic would be the lake of fire topic. That is, quote, prepared for the devil and his angels. This will dovetail a little bit with the heavenly books, heavenly tablets thing, but I think it probably deserves its own episode. So we'll talk about that idea. Again, specifically bringing in, the devil and his angels into that issue. And then once we go through those categories, and I may add the one that we ran into today about what does the term Jew mean. I'm not promising that one, but that may get thrown into this. What I'd really like to do, and believe it or not, don't do a double take. If you're driving while listening to this, you might want to pull over on the side of the road here. But after we exhaust those topics, I do want to do something associated with eschatology. Specifically, and we got into this the last episode when we did Leviticus 26 and 27 about this idea of what is the exile. How can we think about it in terms of being fulfilled or not in Jesus' day? How does that relate to this concept of a tribulation? Because the tribulation is often associated with a remainder of 7 years from Daniel 9. Well, what if the exile's up, in the time of Jesus? What does the tribulation even mean in that context? So I want to focus on exile and restoration and tribulation, just those concepts as it relates to different eschatological possibilities and different eschatological readings of the Gospels and, more broadly, the New Testament and biblical theology. So that will take more than 1 week. I can tell you that now. So I'm going to wait till we exhaust these other ones before jumping into that.
Sounds like a jam-packed 2016.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There'll be lots of good stuff in 2016.
That's exciting. Yeah.
And if people want to recommend topics, they can feel free to do that. I'm not making any promises because I might get 20 of them. I'm going to have to pick. But hey, take a shot at it. Something that would be topic worthy as opposed to Q&A. Because Q&A, we can what's been the pattern? Half a dozen questions or something like that. But these really need a full episode of their own.
Good deal, Mike. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Well, we thank Mike for answering our questions, and we thank you for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.